Hey everybody, welcome to another multi-game My Thoughts On video, and this one I'm calling a Fistful of FPSs, because it's all about a bunch of FPSs that I don't really have all that much to say about individually, so I'm throwing them all into this video instead. So in this video I will be taking a look at 2084, Bunker Punks, Devil Daggers, Receiver 2, and Void Bastards, and of course there will be time codes down below if you want to skip to one in particular. And I'll be taking a look at these in alphanumerical order, which means that 2084 is up first. Now before I get any further into talking about 2084, full disclosure, I was provided a review copy of it by the game's PR folks. And I actually fully intended upon waiting until the game was finished and putting out a review of it, but unfortunately, Feardemic decided that they weren't going to finish development of this. It's just going to sit in early access until they eventually pull it from sale when they make their upcoming game, The Raid, available. So it's definitely a shame that they're not going to end up finishing 2084, but they did release this for $10 on Steam, so I do feel obligated to say something about it, just in case you stumble across it and think it looks interesting. What you're dealing with here is basically a game jam project that was put together with assets from the detective game Observer, which is another game I will be looking at eventually, but I just haven't gotten around to it yet. The thing is, other than being in the cyberpunk genre, and using Observer's assets as a foundation, 2084 doesn't really have anything going on in it that really ties it to Observer, so you might as well treat it as its own thing, and when you do that, you end up with a first-person shooter that really seems to be more of a proof of concept than anything else, and I get that that's basically what they were going for here, but they released this on Steam for $10. They really should have put more into it. I mean, there's basically no enemy variety, there's only one weapon that you have access to, and that's just a basic automatic rifle that shoots out energy bolts, and you can also use the secondary fire to hack into things, which is required to defeat the bosses and is also required to progress, and whenever you go to hack something, it requires you to input a command, which is always just going to be pressing the directional keys very quickly in a QuickTime event. The environments are basically just lifted directly from Observer, and they're all very cramped, very claustrophobic environments where enemies will quite literally spawn out of nowhere in order to attack you. On top of all of that, there's the fairly intense motion blur effects, and more importantly, the very low FOV, which certainly helps to contribute to the claustrophobic feeling of the environments, but it also induces nausea extremely quickly, and it just ends up being incredibly obnoxious to try to play this thing. And the worst part about all of it is that it doesn't even really work as a proof of concept, because you don't really have anything to prove here. It is a very bare-bones, very basic first-person shooter at absolute best, and the only thing that is really unique about it is the hacking mechanic, which isn't exactly something that is unheard of in first-person shooters, and thus really the only thing that 2084 has going for it is the aesthetic. And that's just because it rips assets directly from Observer, because it was an internal game jam project for Bloober Team and Feardemic, so that's not even something that's unique to 2084 in the first place. And while I certainly wouldn't mind seeing a first-person shooter set in the universe of Observer, or more cyberpunk-themed first-person shooters like this, unfortunately 2084 is just never going to get finished. Eventually it's going to get removed from sale entirely, and it just seems like the developers ultimately wasted their time on it, because from what they've announced regarding The Raid, it has basically nothing at all to do with 2084, not even basic prototyping. So there wasn't really much point in them even making 2084 in the first place. And there's certainly no reason for you to play it either. Next up, we have Bunker Punks by Ninja Robot Dinosaur, which is a roguelite first-person shooter where you play as a squad of so-called bunker punks. And of course, in the grimdark future, the corporations have taken over the world and you're fighting to topple them. You'll start the game out only being able to select a single punk, but eventually you will unlock the ability to have multiple punks in your given runs, and whenever a punk dies, then you can continue to play any other punks that are left over on that particular run until eventually you run out of punks and you have to start an entirely new run. Whenever you start a new run, any of the loot that you found on the previous run, and currency and all that sort of thing is lost, and you have to start that over from scratch, But there are certain upgrades that you can unlock that are persistent across runs. Things like, of course, the characters you can unlock, but also additional bunker rooms, because there's a bunker building mechanic, which is how you get all of your major upgrades throughout the course of the run, as well as new items that you can find as loot drops, and of course, new weapons. You're only able to unlock these things at the very end of a run by spending tech, which you'll find in the various levels that you're running around in, and once you've unlocked something through this process, then it will become available in all subsequent runs. Aside from the tech, you can also find cash, which you can spend on upgrades for this particular run, whether that be getting bunker facilities, or getting items from the shop, or even healing your punks if they've come back from a run and had some damage. Obviously, the further you make it into a run, the more powerful enemies you're going to be fighting, and the more enemies you're going to be fighting, so you're going to be needing to get as many upgrades as you possibly can, and when you're starting the game out and you have a very limited pool of unlocks available, at worst the game becomes very frustrating, but at best it's generally pretty boring. Obviously, after you've gotten a few unlocks and gotten a bit more variety, it does get slightly better, but by then you have seen pretty much everything there is to see in the game because it is procedurally generated. All of the levels are just large boxes with very plain layouts and a bunch of enemies thrown haphazardly in at random. The various box-like rooms are connected to each other via long hallways, and you are going to be constantly fighting the same handful of enemies over and over and over again until eventually you get far enough in that it starts introducing new enemies, but even by that point you're going to be fighting those enemies over and over and over again, and there's really not all that much real variety here. There's not really any complexity to the enemies, they don't have any interesting strategies to beat them, they just require you to wail on them until they fall over. And because of the way the weapons are set up, you're stuck with a pistol that is reasonably useful, a shotgun that is only useful up close, an assault rifle that is damn near useless, and a rocket launcher that is surprisingly wimpy for what should be something awesome. Obviously, those options start expanding when you start unlocking new things, but starting out, you're stuck with those and they are really boring to use. In fact, they're so boring to use that I ended up just giving up on the game entirely after about an hour and a half. I'm sorry, but my idea of fun is not grinding so I can make subsequent attempts at grinding easier. You need to have a really solid core gameplay experience for that to be tolerable, and unfortunately Bunker Punks just doesn't manage to do that. Sure, it's fast-paced, but the shooting mechanics themselves are very weak and enemies just feel like total bullet sponges. And between that and the completely soulless procedurally generated levels, it just ends up becoming extremely boring extremely quickly, and I really can't recommend it to anyone. Next up we have the game which I have the absolute least to say about in this video, which is Daggers. It's a game by Sorath that was released in 2016 and is entirely about jumping around and shooting endless waves of demons. It has a very cool retro, almost Quake-like aesthetic to it, and the designs of the various demons are suitably nightmarish, and it's got a really cool horror vibe to it, but unfortunately it has extremely simplistic gameplay that is not remotely my kind of thing. I don't like bullet hell, and that's basically what this is. Don't get me wrong, the game has buttery smooth controls, it's very fast-paced, the actual game performance is fantastic, one would hope given that it looks like this. There's surprisingly no music, but the soundscape is excellent, and it's even got leaderboards that you can compete on if you're into that sort of thing. But when you get down to it, that's all Daggers actually is. It's just continuing to shoot the living crap out of the endless hordes of demons and survive as long as you possibly can to cement your place on the leaderboards. And don't get me wrong, it is fine to do that. It's perfectly acceptable to make a game where it does one thing really well, and that is exactly what they build the entire experience around, but it does also mean that you're going to end up with a very niche game overall, and I just don't happen to fall into the niche that it caters to. But if the idea of a first-person bullet hell shooter that's on permanent endless mode and has leaderboards is right up your alley, then you might as well give it a try if you haven't already. Just don't go into it expecting a proper old-school first-person shooter in the vein of Quake. Next up, we have Receiver 2 by Wolfire Games that was released in April of this year, and it is the follow-up to what was essentially a game jam project in itself, the original Receiver, and it was pretty cool for the idea that it had very realistic weapon handling mechanics. Receiver 2 is basically their attempt to take that idea and turn it into a proper full game, and to some degree they have succeeded. I mean, this is considerably more polished than the original Receiver. It has much better visuals. You have a wider variety of weapons available to you, from your basic 38 revolvers on up through things like Glocks and Beretta 92s, much more modern firearms. The actual weapon handling mechanics are considerably more detailed this time around, where you still have things like having to thumb rounds into your magazines and make sure your magazines are properly seated, or you might need to spin your revolver cylinder around to get it to an actual live round, or whatever the case may be. Because the weapon handling mechanics are so detailed, you have an awful lot of controls you're going to need to memorize, and one of them you need to be very careful of is holstering, particularly with regards to things like the Glock. Because you see, you can holster something quickly, or you can holster something slowly, and if you holster a Glock quickly, it's almost a 100% certainty that it will negligently discharge into your leg and instantly kill you. Because welcome to Receiver, a game where the player character is apparently so incredibly stupid that they don't know to keep their finger off of the trigger when they're holstering something. Oh, but it gets better, because the various guns that are available to you in Receiver 2 will often jam on you, and you'll need to do clearance drills in order to get them back up and running. Now, that's not that big of a deal if you actually know what they are, which is usually just tap, rack, bang. You tap the magazine, you rack the slide, and then you start shooting again, you're fine. But there are some malfunctions in Receiver 2 that will require you to do different clearance drills, and that will ultimately require you to actually learn some things. I think that's what they were trying to go for here. They were trying to sort of teach firearm mechanics and safety, but if that's their goal, then the way they try to accomplish it can be pretty frustrating. In fact, the word frustrating is what I would use to describe a lot of Receiver 2, because as cool as the weapon handling mechanics are in theory, unfortunately they're only part of the game, and the core gameplay loop is just wandering around and finding cassette tapes that you have to listen to all the way through. And once you've listened to enough cassette tapes, then you rank up and you'll encounter more powerful enemies as well as less resources available to you, although you will also unlock additional weapons. It's basically the same core gameplay loop that was in the original Receiver, admittedly with better voiceovers for the cassette tapes, but with the addition of a ranking system, which actually becomes more of a liability than an asset, because if you die, then your rank goes down. Which, considering that the story progression is tied to your rank and the weapons that you're unlocking are tied to your rank, means that any death in this game is incredibly frustrating, and it's incredibly easy to die in this game because you die in one hit. And in fact, that ranking system is precisely what caused me to stop playing Receiver 2, because it just got too irritating having to take one step forward and then getting set back to the beginning because a turret got a lucky shot in. And it really doesn't help that all of the environments are procedurally generated along with all of the ammo and turret placements and such, meaning that whenever you fail, you can't just go back and be like, oh, well, I've memorized the layout, because it's just going to randomize it again. The thing is, you actually can memorize a lot of the layouts because it uses the same handful of areas over and over and over again, and it just becomes extremely dull extremely quickly. This ultimately means that either the game is being really frustrating or it's being really boring, and there's not a whole lot of in between. Sure, it's got cool weapon handling mechanics, but that's not enough to save the experience, and ultimately I cannot recommend Receiver 2 at all. And last up for this particular video, we have Void Bastards, developed by Blue Manchu and released last year. And when you start this thing up, it has quite a lot going for it. It has a very striking, cartoonish art style that works extremely well and just looks fantastic. It's got a great sense of humor, and because the game doesn't take itself seriously, you can very easily get wrapped up in that sense of humor. But then you get past the first impressions, and you actually start playing the game. And that's when you realize that even though a lot of the developers that worked on this also worked on the likes of the BioShock series, this is unfortunately not like BioShock or System Shock. It is instead another roguelite. All of the ships you're boarding are procedurally generated. All of the nebula is procedurally generated. Your character is procedurally generated. And any progress that you make in terms of unlocks or things like that carries over to your next character when you inevitably kick the bucket. This means that, much like with Bunker Punks, the game starts out fairly dull and it gets slightly better as you continue to play, but then you start to realize how insanely grindy it is. You see, to craft any of the upgrades in this, you need a whole lot of materials, and you get those materials by scouring every single ship that you come across. But there are also special materials that you just have to find somewhere, and when you find those, then you can craft whatever the upgrade that uses it is. And as the game progresses and you start to get access to more and more unlocks, you find very quickly that the resource requirements tend to skyrocket pretty quickly, and you are just going to be spending an awful lot of time not really being able to do much of anything about it. But if it were just crafting materials that you need, then that would be one thing, but they make it even worse in the grind regard because they have fuel and food, both of which are required to continue your exploration. You need fuel to be able to jump between the various nav points, and you need food when you jump over to those nav points, or if you just need to rest and replenish some health. Thankfully, those are common enough to find that you're not really going to have too many problems with that, but in your exploration of the various ships, you will very frequently run into randomly generated layouts with random selections of enemies, some of which are way beyond your capabilities, particularly once you start getting deeper into the nebula, and that's going to very quickly pose a problem, because you start out the game with a pistol and nothing else. In fact, you have 3 weapon slots in general, and as of the point I am in the game currently, I've only unlocked 2 of them. You have one for various throwables or deployables, you have one for your primary weapon, which is either a pistol, a shotgun, or a machine gun, and then you have a 3rd weapon slot for a special weapon, which can be things like a stun gun. And like with a lot of games where you have these sorts of roguelite elements, as you continue to get the upgrades, your weapons become much more capable, which you're going to need, because a lot of the enemies are absolute damage sponges and take forever to bring down, which is actually a problem, because unlike in, say, Bunker Punks, where you're constantly getting more ammunition, in this, you are very limited on the ammunition. In fact, it's almost like a survival horror game with the ammunition reserves in some spots. This in turn forces you to rely on the almost non-existent stealth mechanics, which basically don't work, so they might as well not be in the game, or you need to rely on other methods of trying to dispatch your foes. For example, you can convert ship security over to your side, and you can also convert enemies over to your side by using certain abilities and certain weapons, and you can always just try running away if all else fails. But no matter what you do, you're never going to escape the grind of having to go and find as many materials as you possibly can in order to craft the things you need to progress, inevitably dying because you either just got attacked by too many enemies and might have run out of ammo, or you ran out of oxygen, or you ran out of food, or you ran out of fuel, or whatever the case may be. And then the game will start you over with a brand new character at the beginning of whatever section you were just on, and give you a selection of starting equipment and let you loose to ultimately go through it all over again. And it's not like you're going to be finding anything particularly interesting here. I mean, every single one of the ships is composed of the same handful of rooms that are just arranged in different manners depending on whatever procedural generation decided to do with them that particular time. And while the enemy designs look cool, ultimately a lot of times they're actually quite frustrating to fight, and it just ends up being a bit of a mess. And ultimately the game falls into the same trap that so many other roguelike or roguelite games do, which is that it mistakes this core gameplay loop that is actually extremely shallow with something that is actually worth repeating. And unfortunately, it just isn't. And it's a real shame too, because the sense of humor is great and the aesthetic is fantastic, but they're just not anywhere near enough to carry the entire experience, and Void Bastards just ends up being something that's also not really worth bothering with. And the big lesson that the developers of Void Bastards, and also actually the developers of Bunker Punks and Receiver 2 needed to learn was that randomization, procedural generation, is not a substitute for good design. And while you can kind of get away with it in the likes of, say, an actual roguelike dungeon crawler, first-person shooters are an entirely different monster, and if you throw a bunch of randomization elements into that and call it a day, then it just ends up not working. Well, there you have it, folks. My thoughts on 5 different first-person shooters that I don't really have all that much to say about on their own, so I rolled them all into this video. I hope you found it helpful, or at least entertaining, and I'm probably going to be doing more of these sort of themed multi-game MTOs from here on out, because I've managed to have a very large backlog of stuff that actually fits together reasonably well. So you'll end up with things like this particular video, a fistful of first-person shooters, or one that I'm planning as a follow-up for a few first-person shooters more, because any day I can make a reference to Sergio Leone is a good day. So feel free to let me know what you think about that idea in the comments. But anyway, thank you all very much for watching, and if you like the kind of content I make, then please consider supporting the channel on Patreon. Every single cent I get from that goes directly back into the channel, whether that be getting additional games for review, or additional equipment, or whatever the case may be. If you can't afford to or don't want to, that's perfectly fine, I understand, but the option is there if you're interested. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you all in later videos.